Good morning.
Good morning.
It comes down to me to start off the second day. I need to be out of the way because otherwise you won't see the slides. Okay. Right. Since this is a summer school, I'll start as a school teacher. Have you read the text? No, they were circulated. Okay, this is not a pass or fail question. It's just for me to check whether maybe possibly during the conversation or again, hopefully during what I have to say, we'll cover some of the issues about secularization and sort of religion in modern society, because although the word secularization is nowhere to be found in the title of my talk, the underlying context, the overall context that I think we're framing this is the context of living in a secular world, or the context of the process of secularization. I think so, and the reason why I thought that this text that was circulated was helpful was that it kind of frames these concepts in a quite tight way to the Orthodox context, particularly with Greece, as it is in this article that I was using as sort of a reading text. But that's fine. Now, secondly, the second point that I wanted to make is that talking about multiple modernities, multiple orthodoxies, it involves this idea of secularization, but it also involves this idea of movement, of diaspora, of migration, of being Orthodox in a non-Orthodox context, or in a non-majority Orthodox context, and so on. And this is more of a personal caveat. I have only been a priest in the West. I don't know what it means to be an Orthodox priest in an Orthodox country. And that might be a huge disadvantage that I have, or it might be the best thing that ever happened to me in terms of my ministry. Although I was trained for sort of half of my theological education in Romania, where I come from, and I think I still have a pretty good grasp of the reality of being an Orthodox in that country, and in conversation, being with colleagues of mine that are priests in Romania, being a priest in Romania, an Orthodox priest in Romania, I still have to say that I feel that I am one step removed from that context. So I am welcome to be challenged in relation to some of the things that I will say about sort of Orthodoxy in the home countries, as it were. And the third sort of thing, very short point before going into this presentation, is that although we're going to talk about some of these concepts that originate sociologically and sound very sociological, the place where I want to start, and I think where this inquiry starts from, and in a way returns to, is Jesus Christ. Because these questions that I'm trying to ask here are fundamentally about incarnate, contextual identity. So the place where we start and end, I think, has to be the Logos incarnate. And I take as my cue, as it were, these words from Mother Maria Skoptsova. The image of God, the icon of Christ, which truly is my real and authentic essence or being, is the only measure of all things, the only path or way that is given to me. I think it's important to keep this in mind as we think about our identity in modernity, as we use this somewhat abstract concepts and the concepts and words that we kind of fill with meaning in our own way. Father John was making this point beautifully yesterday, that we live in a society where we charge words and identity with their own meaning, and it can differ from one person to the other, even if they share a lot of common history and education and all the rest. So I think to steer us through this, we need to keep this in mind, particularly through this talk, and when we address these issues. Okay, now, Yesterday, as I was browsing the internet, it popped up on my news feed, as it were, this article that Romania's population keeps shrinking, mainly by both by declining birth rates, but also because of migration. It's just a sort of a two-page article, and I've just printed it very quickly. But again, it highlighted to me this wider context in which we consider these issues. And the numbers are staggering in a way. They say that Romania, which is, I think, outside of Russia, possibly the second largest Orthodox country by population resident in the country, Romania had a resident population of 19.4, so almost 20 million people at the beginning of 2019, which is 125,500 lower than in January 2018. So there is, besides the sort of the brain drain and all the rest that we tend to consider, there is also an exodus or a movement of mainly young people who are Orthodox or baptized members of the church. Incidentally, a lot of these people were born just before, like I was, or immediately after the communist system collapsed in Romania. So this is the generation that received religious education in schools, but it doesn't seem to actually in a way make a difference. We'll look at some other statistical data. So this article basically says that overall, I think there's somewhere between 3 and 4 million Romanians that live outside of Romania. And we're not saying the States here, we're saying Europe, Western Europe. And these are mainly under 40s, or just sort of in their prime, people in their work and intellectual and life, in the prime of their life, like that. So with that idea in mind, I thought it would be very useful to actually look at some statistical information to again frame this idea. And I'll go rather quickly through this because it's always tempting to dwell on these things, but you can always go back to this research. So the Pew Research Center actually only sort of a year ago, more or less, had this study published about the age gap in religion around the world. And they were looking at youth, sort of people under 40 and people over 40. And I know this is kind of, I'm moving a little bit sideways from what I'm trying to say, but stay with me because I think it highlights a lot about this multiple modernity issue that I'm trying to address. When we talk about generational gaps, I think we instinctively think about a different modernity with a different age gap, as it were. You know, people in their, I mean, I've lost contact. I mean, I'm in my late 30s, and I've lost contact with people in their early 20s. I don't know what they're using online. So I feel that there's a distance already. So they're already living in a different modernity, both as social individuals, but also as religious individuals, I would say. Or we need to consider that possibility. So they did this study, and they discovered kind of roughly that younger adults under 40 are far less likely than older generations to identify with a religion, believe in God, or engage in a variety of religious practices. And they did this study in 106 countries over the world over 10 years. So it's as usual, that's one of their, they're doing proper research. And what they discovered overall is that adults between 18 and 39 are less likely than those over 40 to say that religion is very important to them in 46 out of 106 countries. So it's kind of half of the countries surveyed. And you might say, well, that's not a big problem. But then you look at the data in detail, and it's quite interesting. And I'm only giving you a few images here. So what they're saying here in this chart, for example, is that in 41 countries, which are in this color, adults are less likely, as I said, to have a religious affiliation. In 63 countries, which is kind of this other color, and it's kind of even. The response is even, and only in 2 countries, and they're both in Africa. It's the other way around. Russia in here is one of these countries where under 40s kind of score really low, or there's a distinct discrepancy in terms of their religious affiliation. So there's already a different modernity living there, and possibly a different, an alternate orthodoxy. And again, this is the same thing in terms of how people consider religion to be very important in their lives. 48 say that yes, in 46 countries they say that it's very important, but in 58 countries, and again, Russia, Bulgaria here, as you could see, possibly Serbia and so on, it's even. So whenever I read this sociologically, I actually see that this is a downward trend. It's very unlikely that people who are in this sort of grey area will actually move into the blue area. They'll go down. Statistically, that is kind of a proven thing, sociologically. And now they also asked about people, their daily prayer habits. And again, in 71 countries, younger adults are less likely to say that they pray daily. Okay, and this includes Russia, Romania, Greece over here. Just pointing out kind of the staple Orthodox countries. Ireland. Poland isn't there. And then at weekly worship attendance, so the Sunday service, let's put it this way. Adults under 40 are less likely to attend religious services on a weekly basis in 53 out of 102 countries. So again, half. And this includes Romania here, Greece, Ireland again, Poland somewhere here. So, to me, these are sobering facts, and I think theologians should pay more attention, and priests and bishops, to the information that comes from this sociological research area, because it will ground our theology and our ministry, I think, in a different way, in a better way, possibly. And also, this is interesting because then we're moving more into the modern multiple modernities issue here. Again, they said that they found out that religion is very important to people in Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Latin America. So not Europe. This is no huge surprise, as it were. But look at this, Russia. So 16% say that religion is very important in their lives. And this is an important sort of marker for people who study religion in the contemporary world to say where things are going. In sort of Romania, which is here, and Greece, and I think these are the Balkans, kind of Orthodox countries, it's somewhere in the middle, hovering. But really, it's in this sort of global south or South America that things sort of look more bright in that direction. Also interesting, weekly worship attendance is most common where life is shortest. I mean, again, this might be a sort of a, it's the danger of it, But it's interesting to look at this and look again. I mean, these are all countries in Africa. It's okay, of course. And then you see Afghanistan, Pakistan, and so on. But look at this. The longer people live, the less likely are they to go to church. Romania is here. Hungary, Serbia, Portugal, whatever. Where's Russia? So Russia's here. So we have this downward trend again in this direction. And again, in countries where people attend school longer, so where they're better educated, as it were, again, they go to church less often. So, this link between education and the fact that we become secularized, this needs to be unpacked a little bit. We look at this and it's pretty clear in a sense. But it doesn't mean that religion is not for educated people or the church is not for educated. It means, I think, that the church is doing a poor job of explaining, and being in tune with modernity, with the movement of society, and the data shows it. And I'll talk about this a little bit. This is kind of a hermeneutical inadequacy or adequacy of the church, both in relation to individuals and communities. So again, same thing. Where is this? Romania is here, I'm just trying to point out the Orthodox countries. Again, Poland is a very religious, scores highly in terms of religious affiliation, but it's still here. So observance, this is a good marker for, and people kind of dish it out in terms of the church attendance. It's not a good. It's no longer a good marker for secularization. I disagree. I think we need to look at this because you need bums on seats, as it were, okay? or knees on the floor, or whatever you call it, or hands in the air, to exist, as it were. Otherwise, you're just a figment of somebody's imagination, or you're a book that was written a long time ago. Nobody opens it anymore. Okay, good. So I think this kind of, to me, this is a sort of a reality check, and it kind of frames the this whole idea about multiple modernities. Yes?
Just a quick question. We looked at similar data in the
Yes.
USSR studies, and I'm wondering if there is a separate depiction of the Christian change. This is all religion, right?
Yeah, but I think it's, yes, indeed, because it's countries, yes, it's true. I think it's even worse for Christianity, as it were. I mean, it's a treasure trove. Their website is a treasure trove for this sort of thing. And even this study, it has about 80-something pages. It breaks down a lot of this data on countries, on some regions, and so I think even this study will be helpful for anyone looking at finding this sort of specific trajectory for each religion, for example. Good. So, with all this, my driving questions for this are: what are the markers of identity making for the Orthodox in the traditionally Orthodox countries? This is my starting point as I'm trying to answer this, and it's probably an unfair one because many people here are Orthodox. They were not born in an Orthodox country, so maybe that's not a fair place to start for them. But the reality is that a lot of the Orthodox in the world are migrants, are people who were born in an Orthodox country and they moved. So I think this is important to keep in mind. But also I think it's important because a lot of the pressure that people have in terms of their orthodoxy, whether they're converts and so on, is related to some of the roots of orthodoxy in the traditionally Orthodox countries. Being Russian, Greek, that sort of identity comes into play. And then the other question is this identity transferable or portable? Is it mobile? Is it flexible? Or is it the opposite? I think that's a kind of a tension that we feel in terms of our orthodoxy. I have to be Orthodox, and this immediately puts me on the other side of everything else, of the world, of society, of other Christians even. And then again, secondary, in a way, questions, or questions that try to go towards an answer. How does this identity equip Orthodox individuals and communities to live in an open, pluralistic, modern or postmodern, globalized, increasingly interconnected world? Is this Orthodox identity universal or parochial? How is it constructed? Is it affirmatively, is it both and, or negatively, either or? It's us and them. You're either Orthodox or you're not. All these sort of dichotomies that we have. Now, I will unpack a little bit this idea about or this concept of multiple modernities, and then I will try and tackle these questions, and that will kind of be my talk. So hopefully, in about 20-something minutes, I'll achieve this. Now, multiple modernities. You might be familiar with the concept, you might not be familiar, but this man, he died in 2010. Eisenstein, he was a Jewish sociologist of religion, and he basically challenged the idea that modernity and westernization are identical. He said we actually need to say that there are multiple modernities across the world, that this Western model of being modern or modernity is not a sort of an iceberg that moves across the world and different countries, different people import it just like that. He says there are differences. And what he said is that, and so he kind of went against the classical theories of modernization from the mid 20th century, so just after the Second World War. that's interesting that that's kind of when the theory of secularization, the paradigm of secularization was framed, the classical was framed in the sociology of religion in the 60s. So these are all things that kind of happen at the same time. So here's a quote from his, there's an article, he wrote a whole book, a chunky book, I think it's got 2 volumes. But he wrote also an article which is kind of a summary of that, Multiple Modernities, it's called. You can find it online easily, but I can provide it to you. So he says that while a general trend towards structural differentiation developed across a wide range of institutions after the Second World War and in the 19th century, early 20th century, with the arrival of sort of the Industrial Revolution and all the rest, he says in most countries, so this happened. Then it affected family life, economic and political structures, led to urbanization, modern education, mass communication, and individualistic orientations. The ways in which these arenas were defined and organized varied greatly from one country to another, he said, and from one region to another, giving rise to multiple institutional and ideological patterns. Such patterns were distinctly modern, though greatly influenced by specific cultural premises, traditions, and historical experiences. And he gives sort of, as an example, and I'm summarizing a lot his article here. In the 20s and 30s, he says, we see the appearance of the first distinct ideological alternative modernities, the Soviet type, which was kind of a direct critique of the Western capitalist model, as it were. And then the fascist or the National Socialist type that we saw in Germany, and it's still quite popular. I think it has a resurgence these days. So just to continue a little bit with this. So what he says is that rather than, as I said, as the development of a monolithic construct, he argues that the history of modernity is a story of continual constitution and reconstitution of a multiplicity of cultural programs. These ongoing reconstructions of multiple institutional and ideological patterns are carried forward by specific social actors, and social actors, the church is a social actor. Sometimes the church is the one who aids or prevents or slows down all of these cultural projects. Again, kind of the lowest possible level is, let's say, the Catholic Church in Germany with the rise of Hitler. They were very instrumental in the cultural project, and the whole modernity vision that was behind fascism. And this is in close connection with social, political, and intellectual activists. Sometimes priests are activists. Sometimes the church is an activist as well as an actor. It's not just a passive sort of participant, but quite an active contributor. And also by social movements, which might be independent of the church, to put that in mind, pursuing different programs of modernity, holding very different views on what makes societies modern. Through the engagement of these actors with broader sectors of their respective societies, unique expressions of modernity are realized. Okay, so now, what constitutes the common core of modernity? This is what Einstein asks in his article, and I think is something that will help us keep in mind moving forward. So he says, well, he kind of breaks it down in kind of a conceptual side of things, and then there's more of a practical side of things, which kind of stems from that. He says the central core of the modern cultural program, as it developed first in Western and Central Europe, involved a very distinct shift in the conception of human agency, of its autonomy, and of its place in the flow of time. It carried a conception of the future characterized by a number of possibilities realizable through autonomous human agency. In a way, that's why Orthodoxy has a problem with modernity. Yes. Because this goes against everything that is in the DNA of Orthodoxy. It's been claimed that Orthodoxy is a pre-modern culture that is kind of living in the middle of this continuing flowing stream of modernity and postmodernity and all the things that we call label our sort of the times that we live in, and so that's why. That's important. It's a different perspective about who we are and the world we live in. And again, he says that in a way, the common core of modernity, if you want a soundbite, is emancipation from the fetters of traditional political and cultural authority. Now, in practice, this kind of is a process that plays out in this way. Again, I'm summarizing his argument. He says there's a restructuring of the center-periphery relations, and you see that kind of in the political agenda often. It kind of changes the structure of a country. You no longer have a king at the top. You have much more kind of horizontal relations, well, at least in theory. So he says that because of these restructuring of center-periphery relations, themes and symbols of protest, equality and freedom, justice and autonomy, solidarity and identity become central components of the modern project of the emancipation of man. So collective identities no longer are taken for granted, but are constructed around these highly ideologized terms. And then you start, and it says that's kind of the paradox of modernity. On the one hand, it aims to create a level playing field, okay? It kind of restructures center and periphery. At the same time, it fragments that level playing field because, you can have people who, huddle around these ideas of equality and freedom, and there's a whole thing. Then people talk about identity, and sometimes they go against one another, identity and equality. That's the whole debate, let's say, about gender issues today, or about, equal pay rights and all the rest. A drive towards autonomous development in all institutional spheres, economical, political, and cultural, also follows up. And this, in sociological terms, is called structural differentiation of a society. We no longer have the church as an example for providing education, medical care, having a hand in the justice system, in the legal system, and so on. So it all becomes quite separate and distinct. Now, again, to make it even possibly simpler, there's an article by him. It's available online. He wrote it in 1966, but I think it's still valid, his description, again, of the basic characteristics of modernization. And he says that, so in a way, what makes a society modern? How do you say that a society is modern? Is Nigeria modern in the same way as the United States is modern, or France or the UK? They all have we all have banking systems there. You can buy stuff at a supermarket. There are tarmac roads and so on, and you can buy Coca-Cola everywhere, I suppose. But that's not what makes them modern in the same way. So he kind of says that you need to see in a society that there is social mobilization, change of residence, mobility, urbanization, change from agricultural to more industrial, growth of literacy. We saw that slide about education and church attendance. See all these things. There's a separation between family and economic occupational roles. The father no longer passes the trade to the son, and all the rest. Democratic systems of government develop, which have institutional expression in pluralistic political organization, in public liberties, and in welfare and cultural policies. So kind of there's a civil society that's developed and it's maturing. It has a voice and so on. Okay. And also there's a growing differentiation of these major elements of the major cultural and value system: religion, philosophy, and science, spread of literacy and secular education. So he says again, religion, science, politics, culture, they no longer, in societies that are modern, no longer share the same kind of common home. They tend to have their own separate spheres of influence and of interest, and this creates a sort of an autonomous living. Now, that's kind of Einstein's argument about multiple modernities. But what I want to say is, and maybe this is something that I felt, is that today we no longer live just or experience just multiple modernities, but simultaneous modernities. It's one thing to be aware that, there's democracy in America and there's communism in Romania in the 1980s. You understand that there's different modernities there, or different realities, social, political, cultural realities. It's another thing, I think, what we're experiencing today, and again, migration is a factor, is to feel that you're living simultaneously, sometimes physically, but certainly we do that mentally, in multiple modalities at the same time. I am connected to the reality of Romania online. I'm connected to the reality of the UK here, both socially, politically, religiously, and so on. I hear arguments about, again, let me bring this up, the most controversial thing about gay rights and LGBT, for example, issues. And they're one way in Romania, and they're a different way in the UK. They're even addressed a bit differently in the church. You're a woman and you might see women priests in the UK and you're thinking, well, we don't have this there, but so you already live in multiple modernities and you ask different questions, but they're simultaneous, and I think this adds another level of complexity, not to even say pressure, on the church or on the ecclesial structures and the church community, because how can I put it? Yeah, maybe we'll talk about this in the questions. But you can't, as a priest, you can't give the same answer in a way, to someone who has access to the internet. If you're a priest in a village in Romania, and there's a 19-year-old man who is your parishioner there, and then he moves to the West to work for 6 months, and then he comes back, he might ask you different questions. He's already living in simultaneous modernities, and your answers will no longer be helpful, or at least make sense to him or her. And so that's something that I think the church needs to consider. We no longer live in this, the Orthodox Church is in Romania, and there's communism, and we have the history of Byzantium and so on. People move. And then you have to think about how you deal with this reality of not just the multiple, but the simultaneous modernities. Okay, now asking the question, trying to answer the questions a little bit, unpack the questions that I raised at the beginning. So, what are the markers of identity making for the Orthodox in the traditionally Orthodox countries? So, as I said, I think it's essential to identify some of these because, and again, the question is how much of these markers or elements are present also, let's say, in a diaspora context, and why are they present, and why are some not present, and what replaces them? I don't have answers to all these questions, but I think these are questions that we need to be aware of. Again, identifying these markers also helps, as I said, shed a light on I hate this word, convert, but on the Orthodox convert scene. As many of these Orthodox indigenous markers, as it were, are sometimes what attracts some to the Orthodoxy, or intrigues them about Orthodoxy, but most often represent what is most difficult or the stumbling blocks on the journey towards formally joining the Orthodox Church for many people. It's always a bad form to quote someone present in the room, but Father Andrew Louth makes a valid point in one of his articles from 2012, I think. And he says something. It was an article he wrote, part of a book. He said Orthodoxy and the Problem of Identity. I have all these references, you can have them. But he says that behind all the traditionally Orthodox countries, Russia, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, lies the ghost of the Byzantine Empire. It certainly did so in the medieval period, and in some form or another it has continued until today, certainly in the idea that there is one church, one ecumeny, one household, under one emperor, under one sort of political arrangement, and so on. So there is an underlying current of homogeneity, continuity, socio-religious identity, a sense of sacredness, I think, associated, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly, with this socio-religious identity, and all of the issues that are related to it. I have to say that, I mean, thinking about these markers, it's kind of going back to a little bit way back, but the Ottoman millet system that was in place in the Ottoman Empire and in most of Eastern Europe during the medieval period only serves to reinforce the connection between religious or faith identity and ethnic identity. And people don't, I think, realize how important that was, centuries of it, and how important still is. I think the root of that is the root of a lot of the issues that we're thinking of. And Stephen Runciman, who wrote a book, a collection of articles, The Orthodox Church and the Secular State, in 1971, he says that the millet system associated a man's nationality with its faith. So it didn't really matter. I mean, you were Greek, you were Romanian, you were whatever, Bulgarian, you were Orthodox. That's how they considered you. So at the level of the person, that kind of drove this identity, religious and ethnic identity, to weld really well. And the administration, people forget, the administration of the millet was allotted to the religious head. So it was the patriarch, ecumenical patriarch, that they were dealing with as a political figure, and as not necessarily the local rulers, princes. And in millet is the Persian word for nation. So the Byzantine model, long story short, has been replicated and adapted in the 19th century stage of the nation-state formation, with nationalism and ethno-religiosity becoming a firm, some would say a dominant part of this new model. So this triumvirate emerged of nation, state, church. And this has given a new sense of orientation to the Orthodox. It has made possible and plausible the retention of the rediscovery anew of, again, what Father Andrew in that article described as the sense of cosmic and ecclesial identity, whereby social space and time, social and religious, social narrative and religious narrative or sacred narrative are joined and feed into one another. The Orthodox need this unity of the social and sacred narrative and the time narrative to be one, to make things, I think, coherent. I won't go into what Runciman kind of says about the differences between East and West in terms of the church, but I'll just say that he says in the West, when we speak of the church, we usually mean the ecclesiastical organization. To the Easterner, the church always means the whole body of the faithful, the Holy Catholic Church of the Creed, or at least the faithful of his own persuasion. So it's much more of an inclusive, integrated system. Well, this relationship between church, nation, state. David Martin, he's an Anglican sociologist of religion here in the UK, makes this very good point about the positive or the negative cycle or the dynamic of the process of nation building in relation to religion. And he says, so depending on whether or not religion was positively associated with the origins and the myth of the nation, as well as the relation of religion to the class structure, to the power and the state, the church or religious affiliation becomes, or not, the carrier of national and cultural identity. In most countries in Eastern Europe, Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and so on, there's this positive cycle. It was always associated with fighting some external threat, whether it was an empire, whether it was an ideology, whether it was liberating from an oppressor, and so on. In the West, it's not quite the same. It's much more of a checkered picture. In France is the exact opposite, where the French Revolution was completely against, had nothing to do with the religious narrative and forming the national narrative. In the UK, it's much more balanced. There's much more of an intertwinement and so on. But this relationship between the development of the national identity and the role of religion in it, I think it also has consequences as regards the process of secularization. Sociological studies show, and usually this is the rule of the thumb, that in Eastern Europe, one finds low secularization in countries where the dominant church appeared to resist either against an external enemy or anti-national regimes. Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Croatia, and Lithuania are examples of this. And you tend to see these days So high secularization in countries where the reverse applies. The Czech Republic is quite secular. Estonia, Latvia, Hungary is a mixed case. And there's because there's a alternation between Catholic and Protestant identity in Hungary. Anyway. So in the countries fitting the positive cycle model, nationalism and ethno-religiosity find common ground, and a process of exchange of qualities occurs between them, a sort of reciprocal legitimation, which, by the way, is manifested most tangibly at the level of state or political class and church relations. In Russia and Romania and Bulgaria, probably not so much in Bulgaria, to some extent in Greece, there is this degree of reciprocal legitimation. The political class looks to the church because it's such a dominant still force in society to be legitimized, and it's the other way around. The church needs that support from the state in one way or another in order not to be persecuted. The nation is sanctified. Nationalism becomes an ersatz religion, which when twinned with religion, as it were, share together in being a source of collective and personal identity and meaning. And this is strongly linked with a sense of homogeneous religious identity and a sense of continuity. That's important, both in ethnic, national, and religious faith narrative. So, we have identity, narrative, memory, continuity, homogeneity, church, state, nation. But also we have kind of these other elements, the Ottomans, the communists, the West, and other Christians. These are all part of the, I think, Orthodox psyche and identity. Sometimes they are somewhere in the basement. Other times they are quite, at the high table, as it were. There's also a sense of fragmentation of the Orthodox Commonwealth into ethnically circumscribed history and journeying because of these elements here. There's a sense these days that there is a special Orthodox destiny and a nationally informed embodiment of Orthodoxy that is uniquely Romanian or Serbian or Russian. And sometimes this idea, this perspective opposed Orthodox to one another. Romanians to Russians and Bulgarians and each way around. And you can even see what's happening today with Ukraine. It doesn't matter they were all Orthodox. The national ethnic narrative of our religious social identity trumps our orthodoxy. So even the liturgy is sometimes captive to this fragmented orientation to the world, and the Orthodox are experiencing it. And I think it's probably a 50-50 divide in the worldwide Orthodox community between those who hear the divine liturgy in a vernacular and those who hear it in the language of their long dead ancestors. To me, this is a huge problem. I can't believe that we're still here. Anyway.
It seems so simple.
Anyway, okay. So the common gospel, Christological narrative and identity has been filtered and mixed in this way, to the extent that we are now in a situation where the Orthodox behave and talk about themselves and about their faith in almost denominational terms. I think Razvan at some point in his thesis and in some of the ecumenical reflections on this brings up this point. This is also something that I think is sort of trickles down in that direction. And they often talk about themselves, the Orthodox, in a secularized way, using cultural, social, historical, economic, and even political frames of reference. Just pick any, I respect a lot the Metropolitan Hilarion, but just pick any of his statements and unpack them a little bit. They read like, a press release that has been, that's both political and religious and theological. You can't do that. I think. Alexander Schmemann referred to this as to the Orthodox Church having lost the consciousness of its universal mission. He says, in the historical road of Eastern Orthodoxy, he says, broken up into small worlds that treated each other with suspicion and hostility and felt no need for each other. We can be very happy Romanian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox. We can see it now. It's no problem that we have no communion nowadays between Rome and Moscow and Constantinople. It's fine. We don't need one another. That's terrible. They treated each other with suspicion, hostility, and felt no need for each other. It submitted to what Solovyov called the provincialism of local traditions. Having first become Eastern, Orthodoxy would now become thoroughly national. I won't go into which is fascinating, the kind of the communist period and how the church dealt with that sort of modernity, but I will look at I will start answering this question now. Which of these elements is to survive or can be sustainably applied in the West? Now, there's two ways to go about this. If we aim to recreate Little Orthodox Russia or Little Orthodox Greece and Little Orthodox Romania, we need all of them. We need all of these elements that I spoke about. And this is to export Orthodoxy as a brand, almost. But this, as we all have seen and know from experience, at best creates a curated Orthodox greenhouse, eventually suffocating under glorious Orthodox greenhouse effect. And at worst, it creates faith enclaves, disconnected from their immediate socio-cultural and historical context. However, if we take our faith, our religious identity seriously in a Western context, we come to realize sooner or later that what is required in order to perpetuate and continue to live out our orthodoxy, and this applies both to Orthodox migrants and converts, what is required is to create and to reshape our communities into voluntary religious communities. But we tend to resist and be reticent to do so because this is a model that feels Western or Protestant almost. Okay. Jose Casanova has a very good quote here. He says, "Churches must cease to regard themselves as the community of cults of a national state and must become voluntary religious communities anchored in civil society rather than in the nation. This step would facilitate the setting up of democratic states and political societies on the individualistic principle of state citizenship rather than on that of ethnic identity." I don't 100% agree with him. There is a kind of a Western thing here, but I think he's onto something. This idea about voluntary religious communities. And this raises, I think, the question. I'm closing, almost heading to the close. He's something that David Martin comes up with. But before that, Peter Berger, who recently passed away, famous sociologist of religion and a committed Lutheran, actually, Christian, he says that nothing in its history has prepared Orthodoxy for the possibility of functioning as a voluntary association. I think he's right. And that's part of the struggle that we have at the moment. A move from taking for grantedness to the possibility of choices needs to happen. In a way, but choices within our tradition, not as it were, not outside. I mean, that is always a choice. But David Martin uses a concept, a term of the portable identity, or portable identities in relation to the rise of Pentecostalism across the globe. And I'm not saying that Orthodoxy should become like Pentecostals. Orthodox should become like Pentecostals, but I think there's something there that we need to pay attention to. Martin says that Pentecostalism, in relation to Catholicism, he compares them. And he says that Pentecostalism is understood as a portable lay identity in counterpoint with Catholicism, which is a mediated identity, in part retaining its relationship to territory, place, and ethnicity. So he says basically that there's the religion of a people in a territory, and then the religion of portable identities, crossing borders through global mobility and communication, creating imagined communities. Someone that I highly recommend if you want to read about these things, Viktor Rudometov, he writes about, he kind of developed, I think, coined this idea about Orthodox Christianity as a transnational religion. The idea of transnational religion is not new, but I think in relation to Orthodoxy and in the context of migration and mobility and globalization is quite a potent one. Okay, now I think the Orthodox Church has to take, on the one hand, more seriously, and has to take context more seriously. And on the other, it has to free itself and its members of what Saint Maria of Paris, or Mother Maria Skuptsova, called the prescribed inheritance of the motherland. The challenge is, in the context of migration, I think, to move from using religion as a means of maintaining ties to one's home country, which people tend to do that at first, and that's fine, but it's not enough, to B, to participate in religious multi-ethnic networks that connect them to their core religionists locally and globally. The main allegiance is not to their original homeland, but to their global religious community. So basically to the common Orthodox identity that we share. This is, again, something from Rudometov, from his article, Orthodox Christianity as a Transnational Religion. He says that this is the problem. This is the transition from using religion as something that tethers you to your home country, to using your religion, I think, there's something that connects you in this world to people, to other Orthodox, for example, in our context, in a different way. And that's a freeing change. But some people see that as quite dangerous. Okay. Actually, Rudometov has no illusion that this is highly unlikely to happen. Because he says, because of the jurisdictional setup of the Orthodox Church, particularly in the West. So that's a huge stumbling block. But I think there are signs that while there may not be a coherent institutional expression of transnational orthodoxy in the West, both in the States and in Western Europe, I think orthodoxy is more transnational and more fluid in practice than otherwise thought. I think there is already a tension developing there. Because people are looking, if people settle, let's say, in the West, they come from Russia, they come from Romania, they come from Bulgaria, they come from Greece, whatever, they eventually feel that tension that they can't live in two worlds at the same time. And they need something from their orthodoxy to help them live out fully in this modern Western context where they live. When that doesn't happen, that's a huge problem. And I think that's when this disconnect happens. Either people move away from the church completely, or then they go on the more assiduous road of trying to find the roots and the question of who am I, what does it mean to be Orthodox, and all the rest. Okay, fine. So, to, I think, maybe sum it up, and that's the last point, and then I'll have another slide with a quote. I think today what we're experiencing are issues of systemic hermeneutical inadequacy in the Orthodoxy today. And I think we have to say this. And we see that this is something that's happening both internally and externally. This is, we could have a whole session just on this, I think. But almost anecdotically, you can think of any example where this occurs. I'll tell you one example, which, again, is just an example. I'm not passing judgment, but I'm familiar with it. In Romania, for example, there is this, it's a false narrative and a false kind of accusation that is brought to the church. The Orthodox Church has built a lot of churches in Romania in the 30 years after communism, literally. There were huge parishes, they needed more physical churches and so on. There's an argument, okay, I think maybe we could have stopped at some point a little bit, saying, okay, maybe that's fine. But there's an argument now saying we need hospitals, not churches. We need more hospitals, we have enough churches. That's kind of something that comes from the civil society or from the newspapers and so on. It's kind of a campaign. Okay, so this is a false kind of comparison, because the church is not the state. It's hospitals, building hospitals, it's the government's business, okay? But they're saying that there's kind of the investment that goes into building church buildings is not replicated. We need more of the money that was spent on building so many churches could have been spent on, because some of that money comes from the state in terms of sponsorship, as it were, for cultural and identity value of the churches. So it could have been used for hospitals. But even the fact that we have this conversation in Romania points to this hermeneutical inadequacy. The church, in 30 years, has failed somewhere if this criticism is levied against it. Because if people or society at large, even if it's secular or secular people, can come up with this argument, you have fallen short somewhere. And explaining why you're doing this, why it's important, how does that connect, why is that not just glamorizing, building churches and all the rest. There's a break in the narrative there. There's a break in the thing. Yes.
Can I just make a point?
Yes.
Lately, after all these arguments, they found out that actually building hospital implies EU regulations, and you have to have a certain number of nurses to a certain number of patients. So everything was down to the politics, not to the church. So it was a blame which they want to take against the church because they couldn't become successful politically speaking.
Yeah. Thank you. Still, the point that we're having this discussion shows to this hermeneutical inadequacy. It's a systemic one. Just one example. Not to say again of the split that we're seeing now in Orthodoxy. How can you have this? It just doesn't make sense. You can't sustain it theologically. You can't argue for it. The only argument that comes is of a secular, national identity, power, influence type of narrative, not Christological. I said we need to keep in mind that quote from Mother Maria at the beginning, in terms of identity and so on. So, with that in mind, I end with this quote from Mother Maria. It's an Under the Sign of Our Time. She says, every time I have a problem asking questions about who I am, what I'm doing as a priest, as a Christian in the West, I read some of her writings. It really clears the mind. So she says, in exile, well, she writes this Second World War, that's when she writes this, during the time of Second World War, but coming from Russia and this kind of established Christianity, Orthodoxy, she says, in exile in the West, we have been liberated from age-old traditions. We have no enormous cathedrals, jewel-encrusted gospel books, no monastery walls. By the way, Metropolitan Anthony of Suraj, I think, has a quote very similar to this in the 90s, I think. He's quoted about that. We have no huge cathedrals and so on. We need to find out how to live as Orthodox without that. So we have lost our environment. Is this an accident? These are signs which we must understand and paths which we must follow. Our calling is a great one, since we are called to freedom. It says, we cannot freeze a living soul with rules and orders. Once in their own time, these rules were the expression of other living souls, but new souls demand the corresponding expression. This is hermeneutical adequacy. And this is, I think, goes to the core of the problems that the Orthodox have today about, how do we deal with the canons, how we deal with all the tradition behind us and so on. She doesn't do away, but she says we need new souls, new expressions that don't do away with that, but are true to who we are and where we live in. If we are free of the influence of the state and power, are we sufficiently liberated from the canon of convictions, customs, and rules that we ourselves create? Everything is so well set up, so habitual, has acquired such solid, even aesthetic form, that oftentimes one cannot even lift a finger to disturb these settled pictures of inner peace. We are tightly buttoned up in our worldview, we are well dressed, we are simply swaddled in it. Thank you.